So, without further ado, I have the lovely honour of introducing our esteemed panel. Orion Brook is Chancellor's Fellow in Social Policy at University of Edinburgh. She studies social and spatial inequalities in the creative economy and holds an ESRC ADR Fellowship exploring earnings of the creative graduates. She's co-author of the book Culture is Bad for You and the report A Class Act, Social Mobility and the Creative Industries, published with the Sutton Trust. She's a member of the College of Experts for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Mark Taylor is Senior Lecturer in Quantitative Methods at the University of Sheffield, UK, Research Partner for Arts, Culture and Heritage at the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, and a member of the Department of Culture, Media and Sports College of Experts. He uses survey methods to interrogate social inequalities in artistic and creative work and audiences. With Orion Brook and Dave O'Brien, he's the author of Culture is Bad for You. And finally, Dave O'Brien is Professor of Cultural and Creative Industries at the University of Manchester. Since completing his PhD on Urban Cultural Policy in the Department of Sociology at the University of Liverpool, he has written extensively on key issues in the cultural and creative economy. His most recent book, Culture is Bad for You, was co-authored with Orion Brook and Mark Taylor. His policy work includes the groundbreaking Measuring the Value of Culture report, and he was a co-author on Panic report, as well as the Creative Majority and Making the Creative Majority reports. Massive round of applause for all of our panel. And without further ado, I will hand over to our very first speaker, Mark Taylor.
Ace, thanks very much, Adam. There's nothing worse than hearing people read out what you said about yourself, particularly when you have a lot in common with the other two people that you're hearing things read out about. It's nice to meet everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As Adam has summarized, what's going to happen is the three of us will give you some of the sort of major headlines and some of the work that we did in the book Culture is Bad for You. We'll then talk a little bit about what's happened since then, and I think that'll help us to go into a broader conversation. So just to give background, the book Culture is Bad for You was originally published in September of 2020. We were originally going to it was originally going to come out in March of 2020. We realized that it wasn't going to be very straightforward to do much in the way of in-person events. And we agreed, oh, we'll push it back to September 2020. That will resolve all of our problems. You can see that version in the top middle of the screen. Earlier this year, the second edition was published, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, which has revised and updated the book with some more recent data and has added some reflections on what's happened since we originally published it, which we'll talk about a little bit more during the course of the afternoon. If you are a Spanish speaker, it has been translated into Spanish very, very well. Orion is a Spanish speaker and can attest to this on the top right. But a lot of the work that we're going to talk about today also builds on a longer standing relationship that we've got. This work didn't come out of nowhere. We've been very generously supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, where the first major piece of work that we did together was the Panic report, which can be seen towards the bottom of the screen. In addition to these texts, if you search Culture is Bad for You on Spotify and you click past where it invites you to pay a load of money for the audiobook, you can also get a regular version of the streaming audiobook for nothing. If you're a premium subscriber, you will not get stuck with any ads. If you're a free subscriber, then maybe you'll get an ad for joining ICE in the US, which, as I understand it, how Spotify works now. It's narrated by Nneka Okoye, who is a brilliant actor. We absolutely love her work on pulling the things together. So if you are interested in the things that we're talking about this afternoon and you're keen to hear any more about them, then that's sort of the context in which we sit. Speaking of the context in which we sit, a lot of the motivation for the work that we've been doing together is that this hasn't come out of nowhere. It's not as if nobody was really thinking about inequalities in arts and creativity until 2020. There's a long history and a long trajectory of reflections on these inequalities coming particularly from people working in the sector and the sectors. And I'll just present a couple of examples here. I think what we've got on the slide here is relatively illustrative of what you tend to see, where a national treasure who maybe came through like drama school in the past, where they were supported by different bits of state infrastructure, whether that was free higher education, whether that was support through things like being able to claim benefits while working creatively in an early part of their career, or something else, laments the changes in society that they've seen. This is a good example where Judi Dench, who's from the north of England, has was lamenting this was a few years ago, the fact that from her perspective, what she did in terms of developing her original development of a brilliant, long-standing creative career is not something that she'd be able to do now. Um, and in doing this, she's contrasting herself with people who are able to make similar creative careers. We've got a list of Eddie Redmayne, Benedict Cumberbatch, Tom Hiddleston, Lawrence Fox. There's a few names that come up quite a few times in this kind of reporting of sort of baddies of white, privately educated men who are, for whom these things aren't a problem. They don't need the same level of support because they have it coming through other routes. It's not something that is limited to thinking about social class. A lot of this is motivated through social class, but equally, there's a lot of absolutely correctly focus on other axes of inequality as well. This is just one of several examples. A few years ago, the BAFTAs, the main acting awards, were overwhelmingly white in terms of their nominees. Led to a campaign called BAFTA So White, reflecting on what looked very much like racial bias in terms of uh, these high profile engagements. And you can think about these things as an ecosystem. It's not as if shortlists are extremely white, but the broader ecosystem is very, very diverse. This is the logical endpoint of a long process. And so that is some of the background in terms of what motivated us to do the work. We're all people that are interested in social inequalities and creativity. There was lots and lots of work going on within the sectors, sort of raising questions about both the sort of long-term persistence and also the extent of social inequalities. And we wanted to start to unpack both the extent of these problems and how these problems come about and how people understand them. So this is the contents of the book. I'm going to throw to, I can't remember if it's Dave or Orion who was going to talk about this to give a bit of an overview of how the thing fits together.
Yeah, what we tried to do with the book was really sort of tell a, on the one hand, kind of cradle to the grave, although not really the grave, obviously, story of creative careers, but particularly how creative careers evolve and how inequalities start really quite young and quite early in people's lives. We also tried to think about creative careers in the context of what we call cultural consumption, but I guess more generally we'd think of as kind of like who goes to stuff and who does stuff in the data was for England, but we can say in Britain today because the patterns are quite similar across the UK's four nations. The other thing, and if you go to the next slide, please, Mark. The other thing we tried to do with the book is really kind of stake out that there are huge benefits to engaging with culture. Some of these are to do with economic growth, so numbers of jobs, the gross value added, as economists would say, to the British economy by creative and cultural activities, whether as kind of industries like people working in theatre, working in film, working in publishing, working in music, but also kind of more generally the economic benefits of kind of art and culture to the UK. These kind of stories of employment and growth have been linked in some ways controversially to the idea that we've got a sort of new group in society who are doing cultural and creative jobs, who are sort of transforming cities, really making kind of places very, very different places to live. And in doing so, as part of that kind of transformative effect of what some people call the creative class, we see quite close relationships to things like urban regeneration. So some of this is to do with the rise of kind of particular creative industries and creative occupations in our towns and cities, but also it's kind of come alongside things like big building programs. So some of the work I've done previously looked at places like Liverpool, who obviously had a European capital of culture, in 2008, they also built loads of kind of new infrastructure. There was a new concert arena and convention center, various the kind of galleries and museums had refurbs. There's a new museum of Liverpool there. You can see similar in Manchester. The factory has recently opened a couple of years ago, and Manchester is a kind of poster child for the idea that cultural buildings and the kind of creative class might transform your city, particularly your city centre. This obviously is really controversial, and there are questions about kind of who engages and who is included and who is excluded, which we're going to pick up on a little bit later in the talk. But that, I suppose, kind of regeneration through culture goes hand in hand with how places get transformed through things like tourism. And this is, kind of traditional tourism, like, visitors coming to go to galleries, go to events, engage in kind of whether it's formal cultural activities or sort of soaking up the cultural atmosphere of a place. But also, there's a kind of broader construction of places as being kind of good places to live, that are, full of pride, full of kind of, I suppose, sort of civic strengthening engagement. Sometimes it's called community cohesion, whereby people who live in places have a real kind of sense of benefits and, I suppose, kind of relationships with artistic and cultural organizations. These sort of big stories of economic, social, and place-based development have also gone hand in hand with the rise of the arts and health movement. So some of you might be aware of the kind of benefits of artistic and cultural engagement can have for a variety of, I guess, quite formal health conditions, but also the more kind of informal stories that we hear around the benefits of art and culture for well-being in general, rather than kind of specific health problems. And this kind of moment of both arts and health and arts and well-being against the backdrop of, I suppose, a longer term story of the benefits of culture is something that we tease out in the book to say, look, we are not saying any of this is incorrect. And one of the things we're really kind of keen to stress is that kind of culture can be good for you. But at the moment, as we're going to show you with some of the analysis in the book, culture is only good for certain groups under certain conditions. And one of the big problems that we've got in kind of contemporary society is the way that the kind of possibility to express oneself, transform where one lives, maybe get a great high-paying job that you feel is, kind of your life's dream or your kind of life's purpose. This set of kind of possibilities of being happy, healthy, and a kind of fully formed, flourishing human being is really sort of unevenly distributed. Do you want to go to the next slide, Mark? And this is where you come back in.
Ace. Thanks, Dave. So I think that's a really helpful overview and a really, hopefully everybody on this call now has a bit of a sense of the stakes involved in this. And it's at this point that I'm going to start pivoting from talking about the stakes to talking about the situation on the ground. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that a lot of the framing of what we're talking about here has to do with ultimately it's about social class. And when I say it's about social class, it's about social class background. So thinking about the kinds of people who are able to work in creative jobs, thinking about the kinds of households that they grew up in, largely framed, as in the Judi Dench case, in terms of the sorts of economic assets and capitals that people have available to them. And this figure maybe puts it pretty bluntly and pretty directly, where in the overall workforce, in the section of the sort of at the time that we were analysing this data, about a bit less than 40% of the population, when they were about 14, sorry, the population of the workforce, people in work, when they're about 14, the main income earner in their household was from a managerial or a professional background. So about half of those people, about 19%, that is what's called a higher managerial or professional background. That includes people who are doing jobs like working as doctors, working as lawyers, working in a job like mine. Another 19-ish% are from other managerial and professional backgrounds. This is a group that includes people working in roles like teachers and doctors. And as a kind of shorthand, these people are often referred to as people from middle class backgrounds. We can contrast that sort of 38, 39-ish% figure for the whole workforce with figures for people working in different parts of what we might call creative industries. In where those numbers are often half as much again. Uh, so in lines of work like music, performing, and visual arts, so this is jobs including artists, musicians, actors, dancers, and so on. In jobs including publishing, which includes things like journalism and novelists. In a lot of roles like film, TV, radio, and photography, which includes things like camera operators, the representation of people from what we might call middle class backgrounds is quite a lot higher. And this is not something which is just a snapshot. In the book, so in the first edition of the book, we looked at, which again was published in 2020, we show these numbers from around between 2014 and 2019. There's a certain amount of volatility in these numbers, but the story is pretty consistent. Over the period that we're able to get data for from 2014 through to 2019, you're looking at overrepresentations of people from middle class backgrounds in almost all parts of the creative industries. There is one exception, which is crafts. I think crafts is interesting for lots of reasons because crafts, when you think about crafts, you might think about people who are working with textiles, for example, working in small organizations, or maybe working with glass. In practice, a lot of people who are classified as having a crafts occupation are doing things like making furniture. A good example of the representation of this is that, and I'll come to this in a sec, is that actually the gender balance within crafts isn't necessarily what you would expect. Other than that, you see a pretty consistent story across the creative industries over time, where the percentage of people coming from middle class backgrounds is a lot higher than it is in other parts of the economy. And these inequalities are not limited to social class. In almost all parts of the creative workforce, the percentage of people who are white is a lot higher than it is in the overall workforce. So in the overall workforce at the point that we were doing this, the figure was about 87-ish%, which can be contrasted with in film, TV, video, radio, photography, 91, architecture, 91, publishing as high as 95. And it's important to put into this context that people working in creative jobs are particularly likely to be working in London. That's 87% figure that we're looking at here for the entire workforce. The London figure is closer to 60. And so even things like music, performing, and visual arts being 85% white, which is a smidge lower than the overall workforce, when you adjust for how heavily concentrated that is in London, it starts to look a bit different. It's also worth noticing that in a lot of these lines of work, a lot of these lines of work are very male. As I say, crafts is only 22% women, architecture 27% women, film, TV, and so on is 29% women. Some of these look a little healthier. For example, museums, galleries, and libraries is an occupational sector that is mostly women, which sounds like good news and it's not. Because when you look at the percentages of people running these organizations who are women, the number starts to look a lot smaller. To put it another way, a lot of the analysis that we've undertaken has made very clear that the sort of reinforced and provided evidence for that Judi Dench position of creative work is visibly a site of significant inequalities. And our focus in the book is on ethnic group, gender, and social class background. And Dave, if you want to, Dave mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about cradle to grave, and now I'll throw it to you to talk about the cradle.
One thing that sometimes happens with discussions of labour market or labour force statistics is it can seem quite kind of dry and quite distant from what the experience of being a creative worker is. And we've just picked out a couple of examples from some of the interview data in the book to try and both tell the story of the experience of being a creative worker in these really kind of unequal settings, but also to try and give a sense of an explanation for some of these patterns. And part of the explanation, it starts quite early in life, and really, as we can see in a lot of contemporary discussions about things like arts in schools or the place of culture in the curriculum, there are really kind of unequal and uneven experiences of access to culture. So this was an artist in her 20s that we'd interviewed from a middle class background. And she was talking about the kind of cultural abundance around when she grew up, the kind of sense of going to art classes, having lots of things to do on Sunday mornings, going to museums, art materials, animals, pianos, horse riding, paper mache, all of this kind of stuff. And on the one hand, the kind of sense of influence and support that was part of pushing her or propelling her or giving her a sense of the possibility of being an artist, but also the way that her experience of kind of cultural abundance meant that growing up she had a very eclectic and very wide range of cultural knowledge that really kind of paid off and was really useful later on entering the art world. And we saw this kind of over and over again in some of the patterns that differentiated those from working class backgrounds, who would often talk about, well, there was the telly in the house, maybe I was lucky enough to live near a library, or I had a supportive drama teacher, as opposed to this kind of story of abundance for those from the middle class. Next slide, please, Mark. Obviously, money really, really matters. And for all of the talk of, I guess, what we as academics would think about as kind of cultural capital or cultural resources, the importance of finance is really clear. So, we've picked out some of the issues with this comment where it's not only, it's really expensive to do an MA. I mean, I'll be honest, finding £3,000 or £4,000 to do an MA reflects quite a sort of old version of how much master's fees are at university. You can probably times that by 10, particularly if you're an international student now. But that kind of sense of education, fees are expensive, getting into volunteering positions basically, means you're not being paid. So, how do you compete in the job market with people with MAs and people who can volunteer? The kinds of cultural resources that I've just been talking about are often intertwined with access to the most, as our interviewee is commenting, prestigious positions, British Museum, V&A, etc. And obviously, if you're volunteering at places like that, even when you get your foot in the door, you're still living in London with housing costs and things like that. And yeah, throughout the book, we talk about the importance of money, both as something that often isn't talked about for middle class origin people who go on to have career success, but also how it's something that in many ways institutions kind of depend upon free or unpaid labor and don't like to talk about it either. Next slide, please, Mark. I talked really about kind of getting in and the kind of barriers to entry. So, what happens early in life and then what happens at the start of careers. One of the things we were keen to do in the book is talk about class in an intersectional way. So ask how class relates to things like, say, gender or racial inequalities. And in these sets of comments, both from the same person, a sort of middle-aged black woman who was very successful in various bits of cultural and creative industries, we can see the way that even when you kind of make it in, you're still, I guess, kind of up against sometimes hidden, but sometimes quite explicit forms of bias and discrimination that mean that we see careers that if we were kind of charting, I suppose, a posh white man's career would end up, running organizations or having higher pay or being more kind of prominent. But actually, in this case, we can see the way that there are steeper or taller hurdles, bigger barriers to be overcome. So whether it's the idea of someone's race, and we can also extend this to things like class and gender, being the only kind of reason that they might be approached, irrespective of their, kind of creative activities or career success, but also I suppose the kind of frustration of that sense of being reduced to a particular part of your demographics, not being given opportunities because you're seen maybe as the diversity hire, or then being offered opportunities that actually come with quite a lot of strings attached, and the, I suppose, kind of unspoken exploitation that goes along with this. Orient's going to talk about how this has kind of changed over time shortly. But one thing it's worth saying is these examples, although they kind of tease out class, gender, and racial inequalities, they flag things like cultural capital and economic capital. It is worth saying being a creative worker is kind of hard for everybody. It's really difficult for everybody to make it. You need, quite a lot of luck, as well as the kind of social, economic, cultural resources we've been talking about. But one of the things the book does is to try to say we get it's difficult for everybody, but at the same time, it's even more difficult for particular social groups. And we shouldn't let that kind of moment where people are saying, oh, it's difficult for everybody, obscure just how much more difficult it is, particularly when we're trying to explain why we've got the unequal patterns in the workforce that we've got.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yes, just circling back now to the beginning of the first the first edition of the book, where Mark was introducing the Judi Dench and other luminaries, talking about how they wouldn't be able to get into the occupations, the creative occupations that they're now in, leads back to this looking at how these issues have changed over time. So one of the things that came up when work that, like what Mark presented at the beginning about looking at the sort of proportion of people in creative occupations from middle class backgrounds was published, the kind of reaction from the industry tended to be, well, that's a new development. They didn't used to be like that anybody used to be able to be an artist and everybody went to art school in the 70s. And what a shame that's no longer the case. And the sort of focus on explanations for those kinds of social class inequalities tended to look at things like the introduction of university fees, the reduction of, or the greater difficulty in accessing unemployment benefit while you're developing your creative practice, the increasing costs of living in London in particular. So what this does is we're looking here at an analysis of the longitudinal study, which is basically linking censuses through time, and I won't go into the technicalities of it, but what it means is that we can look at people linked over time who were born from the 1950s, from the mid 50s, to people who were born in the 90s, and we look at whether or not they ever worked in a creative job. And what I'm not including here the kind of jobs that we were seeing in the full panoply of DCMS categories like IT and marketing and so on, but we're really focusing on performing arts, artists, writers and publishing, TV and film, museums and archives and galleries, those kinds of places, those kinds of occupations. And so we can see that, so in the left-hand panel, we've got people in those kinds of creative jobs. And in the dark line is people from more middle-class backgrounds. Sorry, The dark line is people in arts jobs. The left-hand panel, we have people from middle-class backgrounds. So we can see that consistently. For the cohort 1 is born in the 1950s, cohort 4 is born in the 1940s. And we can see that, and this line represents the proportion who ever worked in creative occupations, in core creative occupations. And we can see that on the one hand, the proportion of people from arts, working in arts jobs from middle class backgrounds is about double what it is in other jobs. And we can also see that it's risen considerably over time. And we can also see that there's been a similar kind of more or less parallel rise in the proportion of people in other jobs from middle class backgrounds over time. And on the right hand, we see people working class backgrounds. And again, we see about half the representation of people from working class backgrounds in arts jobs. And we see a big fall in that over between the cohorts. And we can see again about double the proportion of people with working class backgrounds in other jobs. And we again see a big fall in that. And what that is telling us is that actually, whilst the representation of people, Judi Dench and others are right, that the representation of people in arts jobs has become much more middle class over time. But that doesn't mean that that the chances of somebody from a working class background getting into creative jobs has got worse. It hasn't. It hasn't changed. And that, on the one hand, can be a sort of technical difference between relative social mobility and absolute social mobility. And it's explained by a huge growth in the number of, in the proportion of the workforce that's in slightly more qualified, slightly more sort of white collar jobs. But on the other hand, it also invites us to look for other explanations for why have the chances of somebody from a working class background not changed. And if it's been consistent over this period of time, then maybe it's something to do with the creative sector rather than something to do with that, rather than other people creating the conditions. Mark, do you want to just have a look for the next slide, please? So this is sort of basically, this is basically saying the same thing. NSEC 1, higher managerial and professional, NSEC 2, lower managerial professional. The different coloured bars represent the different cohorts. There's no significant change over time between the cohorts. We can see also that there is a marginally positive effect for being a man in terms of working within the arts, although, as we said, that this doesn't look at how senior somebody is, and we can also see the significant effect being from London in there. Next slide, please, Mark. And going back to the contents now, which Dave talked about a bit earlier, is we can see I've gone through some of the kind of important highlights of the book. There's a lot in there that we've not really had time to discuss very much. We've hardly talked about cultural consumption at all, except for in children. We've not. What about the men is one of my favourite chapters, and really kind of we're looking at the interviews with senior men in creative occupations, whose position is basically that they recognise and they lament the social inequalities in creative work, but they at the same time kind of don't find that they have any power to change anything. And then when they talk about their own careers, they describe all the luck that they had, all the opportunities that they had that they weren't the best qualified candidate for, but somehow came their way. And it's the lack of the inability to link the perhaps unearned luck that they had in their own careers with the fact that other people who don't look like them and sound like them don't have the same extent of luck, which I think is sort of part of the problem in terms of looking at why these inequalities are so difficult to change. Mark, do you want to move on?
Yeah, I think it's me now. We'll find out in a sec. So, as was advertised earlier, we said we'd spend the first part of the session talking a little bit about some of the findings in the book, particularly some of the findings in the original edition of the book. And now we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what's changed since 2020. I should clarify that this is a very slightly disingenuous title in that we are going to talk a little bit about what's changed since 2020, but we're also going to talk about some of the other things that we've been up to since 2020. So some of the broader bits of context which might be helpful or interesting to people in a conversation like this. And one of the first things that has changed since 2020 is the policy context that I'm throw to Dave to talk about for a minute or two.
Yeah, so I'm assuming everyone is aware there was an election last summer. There was a change of government, and the new government came in with some, I think, different and distinctive policy preferences or emphases. But at the same time, there is a fair bit of continuity actually when you start to dig in to cultural policy. And there's a couple of, I suppose, kind of moments of pause as well. So Labour have done various kind of reviews and of sort of taken time to do a lot of thinking about various bits of the art, culture, creative industries, and education system. Some of those are reported, some of them haven't as yet. The big kind of set piece that has reported is the industrial strategy. Creative industries were one of the kind of eight core industrial strategy focus areas, the kind of priority areas. And you can read the creative industries sector plan, which sets out quite a fair bit actually about kind of pipelines for talent, inequalities, diversity issues in key occupations and industries in the cultural and creative sectors. That, in some ways, is different from the Conservatives, but it's worth noting the Conservatives had a creative industry sector vision sort of 5 or so years ago, or maybe slightly before that. And they had an industrial strategy slightly before that as well. So there's a kind of continuity a little bit there, even if individual kind of bits of policy are different. There's a curriculum and assessment review looking at the kind of whole school curriculum, which has had an art and culture kind of element to it. And various ministers have talked about the importance of art and culture in schools. On Monday, the government published its post-16 education skills white paper, which is meant to align both the kind of FE, vocational apprenticeship, and higher education systems with the industrial strategy. And again, there's important kind of implications for arts, culture, and creative subjects at universities. And then there's an ongoing review of the Arts Council led by Baroness Hodge, which has not reported yet. And I flag all of these things partially to kind of say, whilst this political context seems to have changed massively, the kind of overarching questions about funding, lack of funding, what kind of key organisations such as the Arts Council are there to do, particularly around the Let's Create programme and framework, are actually kind of carrying on. The government has emphasised in various kind of speeches and set pieces the need to get to grips with the inequality issues in the creative sector. And they've got this thing called the Opportunity Mission, which is meant to be a kind of cross-government framework or set of unifying principles that focuses government activity around things like sort of not social mobility, because they don't use that term, but broadly kind of social mobility issues. But a lot of that is concentrated on early years, where there is an important role for arts and culture, but it's not been as central as perhaps some of us thought it might be when they came in. That policy context matters because if there is, although very different political party in charge, but some important continuities, it sort of raises the question of what's been happening with some of the trends and some of the issues that we identified in the book. So back to you, Mark.
Yeah, because I think as Dave says, a lot of things have changed in the policy context. What's also very, very relevant is that so when you look at the foreword at the sort of introduction of the first edition of the book, which we wrote, we sort of finished everything else, and then lockdown was starting to kick in, and we realized it was really important to provide this framing. Through early parts of the pandemic, there were a lot of conversations about how this was an opportunity for a reset, an opportunity to rethink how we did culture. Everybody changing their ways of working, transformations in practice, both in terms of how people were spending their time professionally and also how people were spending their leisure time, really felt like it was an opportunity to change things. And one of the things that really changed was not very much. All of those demographic trends that I showed you from 2014 to 2019 look almost identical from 2019 to 2024. Those questions about socioeconomic background, which we started by talking about, nothing has really changed there. In a lot of the bits of the creative industries that we're especially interested in, occupations like artists, musicians, actors, authors, journalists, museums professionals, and so on. Those are occupations that are still overwhelmingly occupied by people from middle class backgrounds, in most cases, overwhelmingly occupied by men, and in most cases, most of those men are white as well. We don't really see any transformations. There's one slight qualify to that, which is it does look like there might be a bit of a shift in terms of proportions of disabled people working in these occupations. In the first edition of the book, we didn't write very much about disability, but in some related work that we've been doing, we've been unpacking some of the data in the census that took place in 2021 in England and Wales and 2022 in Scotland, sorry, 21 in the north of Ireland as well, where we find that actually, we've presented a lot of what we've been presenting so far has felt quite negative. I've talked about creative work being a major site of sexism, racism, and classism, and that's true. What's also the case is that the percentages of disabled people working in a lot of these occupations are actually a little bit higher than in most parts of the workforce. And there's some, I don't want to get overexcited about this, but there's some evidence of an upward trajectory in that. This is something that we're keeping an eye on rather than asserting confidently, but there are some possible green shoots there. Having said that, in other parts of creative occupations, we don't see changes like that. The story in terms of social class, gender, and ethnic group, in terms of what's changed since 2020, is not very much. I'll also throw to Orion so a couple of minutes ago, I said that we have got this sort of cradle to grave approach. One of the bits of work that we've been able to do more recently is thinking about the role of education and particularly higher education, the sector in which we're all employed. So Orion, over to you.
Mark, yes. So yes, we've been doing work of various kinds or with different data sets looking at, because higher education is such an important route into creative work, not exclusively. Obviously, there are people who go into creative work without attending university, but they are not necessarily more equal in terms of their social class background and other factors than those who do go through a higher education. But then, of course, there's a huge sorting into different kinds of higher education institutions, more or less prestigious. And to what extent is it about the education that the institution or the degree offers, or to what extent is it about the social connections that are made at the institution? So I've been doing some work that links education data to earnings data, looking at tax records, all very carefully protected. But so one thing that's worth noting is that if you look at creative graduates, there's a lot of interest in the various reports that have come out suggesting that creative graduates earn less than other people. And I've been doing some work on why might that be. So creative graduates are disproportionately female. This is looking at people who graduated in 2009. They are more graduates in total are female than male, but also a much higher proportion of them, a proportion of women are female graduates than male, and nearly twice as many, nearly 2/3 of creative graduates are female. But then when you look at their earnings, the earnings gap for male creative graduates is much wider. So male creative graduates earn just shy of £30,000 10 years later, whereas male graduates of other subjects on average earn closer to £48,000. Now, this is only looking at people who are in employment in terms of pay as you earn, per long term, at least no, it doesn't have to be long term, but an employment contract, not freelance, not self-assessment work, which creative graduates are also more likely to go into, but I'm not including them here. Whereas for women, it's more like 25,000 to 33,000. There's still a gap, and I can talk more about what the explanations for that gap might be. But overall, in terms of this work, it would suggest that the explanation for lower earnings of creative graduates is partly that they go into lower paying occupations like teaching. And like creative industries, but also that it's about the gap between what they would earn, because creative graduates are disproportionately from middle class backgrounds, disproportionately male. They're not disproportionately from more prestigious universities, but basically the gap is between what they would have earned if they hadn't done a creative degree versus what they earn having done a creative degree. And that gap is not very much for women, for people from post-92 universities, for people from working class background. It doesn't make a huge difference whether they have a creative degree or not in terms of their future earnings. It's only for white middle class men graduating from higher status universities where really there's a wide gap in what they would earn. They still earn more in creative industries work than people from working class backgrounds, women and so on, but it's the gap there that really explains that sort of difference in earnings. Mark, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. And just to kind of underline this, so there's an assumption that the sort of low earnings of creative graduates is about a sort of lack of employability, but actually there's no evidence for that. Creative arts and design graduates are absolutely average for the proportion that are in employment 10 years after graduation is absolutely average for across all graduates. So do you want to go to the next slide, Mark? I think we're probably not going to talk about that much, except just to say that actually there's a lot more. Separate from this is too much to go into today, but people in creative work are more likely to have two jobs. They're more likely to combine creative work with something else like teaching, often teaching or otherwise kind of service jobs. And actually that can be quite a stable long-term pattern. It's not necessarily just that they use it as a way to get into creative work. People seem to be maybe choosing that working pattern for a long time because it can smooth out the kind of the peaks and troughs of availability of creative work if you do it alongside, for example, teaching. But as a result, creative graduates and people in creative work are more likely to work part-time in their main job and then hold a second job, or have a part-time main job and then work freelance. And that's also shown in the proportions of people who say when asked in the Labour First survey why they're working part-time, they're both likely to say that they didn't want full-time work or that they couldn't get full-time work if their full-time work is creative. And I'm going to hand over to Mark.
Ace, thanks. So I mentioned at the start, well, a few minutes ago, that one of the things that's happened in certainly the creative workforce was not very much. I'll now talk a little bit about some of the things that happened in terms of cultural audiences, because, I was presenting the idea of a possible reset, a possible rethink of the way that we deliver and undertake culture. And I'll start by talking a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen within the period since lockdowns, where I think, on a call like this, it won't really come as a surprise to anybody that the percentages of people who, when you ask them, have you been to the theatre? Have you been to a gig? Have you been to an art exhibition? If you in the last 12 months, if you ask them that around the start of 2022, most people were saying no. Those numbers have been coming up. The numbers for 2025 have been very, very recently published by DCMS, so recently that I've not had time to squeeze them into this presentation. But the number, we do seem to have seen a recovery. There doesn't seem to have been a permanent scarring effect where there have been generations of people who, where there would have been a period where they would have gone to their first show, their first exhibition, or something like that, which has led to a lack of engagement. What's particularly encouraging is the percentage of people who are engaging with arts, doing things like painting or drawing or photography as an artistic activity or making crafts, those numbers are on a positive trajectory as well. However, what is a little bit less encouraging is that the old inequalities are back. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we knew that different forms of audience behavior were quite major sites of social inequality. The percentages of people who go to the theatre who are from middle class backgrounds or who are living in middle class households, for example, they're working in a middle class job, are much, much, much higher than those equivalent figures for people in working class households. What I'm showing here is a screenshot of a dashboard based on a load of DCMS data on the ways that people spend their time, which was built by my brilliant colleague Roshi Wang. I've drawn attention here to one example, which is the percentages of people in different kinds of occupations who say they went to an art exhibition in the last 12 months. Purple bars are the year 22-23, the orange bars are 23-24. And what this shows is that the numbers went up across the board. For all groups, your chances of going to an art exhibition were greater in 23-24 than they were in 22-23, which is roughly what we would have expected, but it's reassuring to see that is how things panned out. But what's also the case is that for people in middle class households, that increase was greater than it was for people in working class households. So, to put it another way, the inequalities which significantly marked audience behavior prior to the pandemic are more or less back. I don't want to sort of beat people over the head with this. I could do this by saying, and this is theatre, and this is comedy, and this is cinema, and so on. And similarly, in this case, I've just drawn attention to social class. There are similar stories that I can tell you in relation to other dimensions such as gender or ethnic group or lots of other different things. But the general trajectory, there's exceptions, of course, there's quite a lot of idiosyncrasies, but the general trajectory is a story of a return to social inequalities. And finally, I'll just throw to Dave to wrap up in this section.
Yeah, Mark's mentioned the pandemic several times, and we were slightly conscious that we've thrown quite a lot of graphs at you all for the last kind of hour or so. And so we thought we'd finish by going back to the new edition of the book, flagging something that we've done in the new edition of the book, but trying to kind of bring some of the themes together. So a bunch of us, mainly led by Tal Feder, who was a research fellow on this project we did about the impact of the pandemic on the cultural sector, wrote a paper that tried to look at data about cultural consumption during that kind of pandemic moment of 2020. And we were struck by the difference between some of the stories of cultural engagement that were coming particularly from workers in the cultural sector, and maybe got kind of taken up in some of the newspapers of, everybody went onto YouTube, they started either doing like workouts with Joe Wicks or yoga with Adrienne, that, they took up new crafts, started singing with their neighbors across the way in apartment blocks, and were generally kind of hitting these kind of cultural and creative peaks enabled by digital means. And we didn't find any evidence of that at all. And what Mark was saying about the kind of gap in engagement around social class, but we also see it with race, gender, issues of geography, education level, lots of different ways of stratifying or kind of dividing up cultural consumption. We saw that really kind of clearly with the COVID-19 pandemic. So even though things like the Met in New York were, the Metropolitan Museum in New York were kind of saying, look, you're all doing things like pictures of your dogs that look like famous paintings, and we're putting them on our Instagram, or the National Theatre was streaming some of its famous plays on YouTube, which I have to admit I watched quite a lot of during that period. That was really sort of unusual. And what we found was that people who weren't kind of particularly engaging with culture, which is a sizable proportion of the population, carried on not engaging with culture, whilst people who were already really heavily engaged with culture would, kind of go digital a bit. But the kind of gateway for going digital was really being into stuff before the lockdown happened. And it brings us back really to where we started. It was clear that cultural engagement, arts and culture as an activity, but arts and culture as a kind of set of objects, products, things to be kind of watched, listened to, or read, was really, really vital. Culture is good for you during the pandemic. It's just it only seemed to be accessed and engaged with by a sort of relatively small proportion of the population who were already experiencing the kind of benefits of cultural engagement. And I think this, as a moment to end, is the big challenge. How do we make sure that these opportunities offered by culture, not just in terms of kind of helping you cope with lockdown, but also more broadly when we're thinking about the chance to be a cultural and creative worker, aren't just restricted to smaller and specific proportions of the population? And that will do.
I guess the first question to the panel would be, how do you define, this comes from Lisa Mitchell, by the way, how do you define working class within this research? Is this more fluid now, and have things changed in terms of our class system?
So I can take this one. So for the stats, the things like the Office for National Statistics, labour force survey data, and the stuff from the census, we basically take an occupational definition. So in the kind of stats we use, and in the kind of contemporary sort of sociology of class, there's basically a big long list of every job in the country, and that gets put into, or it corresponds to, 7 different groupings, which we can then kind of boil down into 3 different groupings of kind of middle, intermediate, and working class. These things change over time. So, for example, journalism is quite a good example. Being a journalist is now really at the kind of top end of the class scale for a variety of reasons. But actually, it didn't used to be. It used to be kind of in the middle. Where are we sort of 30 years ago? And you see changes around things like computer programming as really obvious examples too. The class composition of Britain has changed quite a lot as well. There are not very many coal miners in the UK. 100 years ago, there were loads. There are a lot more people working in offices doing admin than there were 100 years ago, although there were still a fair few kind of back in the day. That changing kind of class composition is something we try and capture, looking at changes over time. It's also really important when we talk about class origins, so the kind of social class starting points that people have. If there are more kind of people in middle class jobs at the moment, it means there are going to be more middle class origin people over time. We're also very keen, and we've done this in the book and some of our other work, to kind of say class equals job is one way of thinking about social class, but there are lots and lots of others. And it's worth sort of separating out the way we might use class to think about statistical patterns in Britain's, say, labour market or its workforce, and then the kind of subjective experience of class as an identity. And I think that is something that's really important. Sometimes objections to kind of how class gets talked about, particularly in the kind of stats, is, well, I don't feel that represents me, or you've sort of said because I'm in this job, I'm really posh, but actually, I came from a background where there was no money, or something like that. And so we're kind of trying to say there are lots of different ways of thinking about class, and the best kind of research on this is stuff that really teases out the way that these things interact, sometimes work together, are sometimes contradictory. And to give you a slightly, well, I was going to say famous, but it's not. But myself, my colleague Sam Friedman at LSE, and his postdoctoral research fellow Ian MacDonald, basically worked on this paper where we looked at the kind of subjective meanings of social class for different occupations. And we were quite interested in people who would not lie about their class backgrounds, but the ones who seemed to have the biggest distance between the stories they told about their kind of upbringing and then what class they'd say they were in. So, for like people who are accountants, they tend not to be too bothered about where they grew up, and they tend to be like, yeah, I'm probably in a middle class job now. We found with actors and television producers, some of the poshest people we'd interview would be like, I'm from really humble beginnings. And at one point, we got something trending on Reddit, which was one of our interviewees from that data set said something like, I did go to public school, but it wasn't one of the really posh ones. It wasn't one of the really expensive ones. And so I'm kind of normal like that. And Sam had this thing in The Guardian with it as well. And that's quite a nice example of where we can kind of tease out issues of inequality, different understandings and meanings of social class on a subjective level, but also we've got this kind of occupational version too.
Have you identified any reasons to be hopeful about the future?
So we're all losing this game of chicken. Well, but me most of all. All the time, I am going into arts organisations that are doing really cool and interesting work. So I work in Sheffield. Last week, maybe the week before, I went into something called Canada House, which is a very beautiful heritage building that has, as with a lot of Sheffield, has this incredible heritage history. When I came up for my job interview, it was an all-you-can-eat Chinese restaurant. It's been derelict for about a decade. And it is in the process of being taken over by a load of youth music charities based in Sheffield, where the idea is that it's going to be a youth music hub. It's quite complicated from a civil engineering and from an architectural perspective. It's very difficult to run a music venue in a historic building right next to a busy road that has got a tram stop on it, while making sure that your soundproofing is appropriate. But there's loads of things going on like that all over the country. This meeting was started by you mentioning that you are soon to be moving into a building, which is very, very exciting. There's loads of good stuff going on. When you read about the kinds of things that the Arts Council England is funding, Arts Council gets stick all the time. And a lot of that is justified, but a lot of it isn't. And I often find myself thinking, careful what you wish for. If we're not willing to support the Arts Council and its current strategy, Let's Create, which is all about making sure that everybody is represented and able to engage with culture. If you're not supportive of that, then I think you're in quite dangerous territory. There's loads of good stuff going on all the time. and the enthusiasm and commitment of people working in arts and cultural organizations is, I think, a really positive thing and a reason to stay positive. Because if you just get fatalistic about this, like if people don't keep pushing, then it's very easy to see how things can get worse. At the same time, it's difficult to see how things get better. I think a lot of the interventions that we've talked about, like the sort of comparisons we've been talking about, one of the questions is, given all of this, why isn't it even worse than it is? And I think a lot of the answer to why isn't this even worse than it is because of the incredible amounts of grassroots activity going on all over the country. But I often find myself wondering, is this it? Is this the best we can do? Or like, and is it the case that, my suspicion is that the sort of activity that's going on is mitigating against things getting even worse rather than helping to make things get any better. It's a bit of a downer.
No, that's great. Orion, I know that you were smiling as Mark was talking. I don't know if you want to comment or add anything.
I knew that Mark would have a good response to this, but I think that I think that there are mild reasons for some optimism. Let's not, we're not, throwing any parades, but I think I've seen a big change in programming, and I think the understanding of programming and about how this sort of, I think that there has been something of a shift from this kind of deficit model of why aren't young people and people from ethnic minorities, why do they not like classical music, and we just need to make them come and then they'll understand how wonderful it is. And I think actually really understanding that kind of diversity of programming and a kind of representation, how important that is, that's been a big change. I think that there is and I think just in terms of these conversations, there's a lot more openness to this kind of conversation, whether it's always happening at the levels that actually it needs to happen, or whether in terms of more senior people, or whether, I mean, ultimately, it's difficult for people's sort of capacities for kind of, I don't want to say self-deception, but kind of understanding actually how these inequalities come about, that can be difficult to accept. And I think the whole kind of the fact that these sort of, cultural tastes are so sort of socially constructed, and actually the thing that you like because you had a good education doesn't mean that the thing you like is actually objectively better than the thing that somebody else likes. Those sorts of very, very basic things that are difficult to shift, even if the actual definitions of what they like changes. But yes, I think these kinds of conversations are going on, and I don't think any of us would claim responsibility for that. But I think we've been part of these kinds of conversations broadening out and taking place more often, and hopefully and I think to some extent filtering up. And hopefully that might make more of a difference to the actual kind of experiences of people in the workforce, and the experiences of people attending all these amazing venues. So yeah.
What do you think is the biggest change that would shift the narrative in the next decade? And that comes from Kath.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, and picking up on something Orion was saying, I sort of think audience demand is kind of important here. And for all of the kind of discussions we've had about like the workforce and about like consumption patterns, often some of it, some of the really kind of like powerful changes can be when audiences are like, we want to see this, we want to go to this thing, we've sold out this particular thing, or, we're willing to pay for this particular thing. So thinking about how audiences have a kind of important role to play, because in some ways, kind of particularly on the commercial end, like the money will follow audiences and audience demand, and that can be a really important kind of practical thing people can do by supporting the kind of creatives they'd like to see getting more work and more representation.
Great, thank you. Mark, anything from you?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen sort of in the last few years is, and I need to be a little bit careful with this, but people are willing to spend money on culture that they love. There's often a temptation to think, oh, the problem here is that like we need to make all of our tickets a fiver in order to persuade people to come. And I heard a story from a guy who worked in audience development who uh, was from a working class background and got asked, do you think to basically persuade people like you to come, tickets need to be cheaper? And he said, no, because if tickets are a fiver, everyone will, like from my background will assume it's crap. Um, there is genuine demand. People love culture. People are willing to spend money on it. Like making sure that organizations are responsive to audience demand. Just give the people what they want.
Yeah, I think that idea that actually responding to audience demand doesn't mean kind of lowest common denominator. I think actually that, a wide range of people have really interesting cultural tastes. And absolutely Mark's point about, people, cheaper doesn't necessarily make it more accessible. And actually, that's very often in the past has been a response to, oh, how do we get more people going to the theatre? It's like, oh, we need to reduce the ticket prices. Generally speaking, that's often a way of getting people who already go to the theatre to go more often. But actually, and I'm not saying price isn't a barrier, but actually lack of interest in what's on in the theatre is first and foremost the barrier. So actually put on stuff that people are interested in seeing and then worry about how much you're selling the tickets for.
So somebody said, thanks for a good talk. What do you think about the potential for Arts Council England's Creative People and Places funding as part of the broader and continued levelling up agenda to redress the imbalance in arts creation and consumption?
Look, all money is good. There is a financial crisis in various bits of the sector. So all money is good, and place-based money is, full of potential. And I think one thing that academics can be quite bad at is we tend to be like relentlessly critical, rather than saying, actually, this is useful. I think there are definite downsides to the place-based agenda, particularly places that don't have infrastructure and send what we might think of as electoral signals by who they vote for, that they are not interested in benefiting from government money. But look, all money is good given the state of the sector.
Was running short of time, so I'm just going to pick out one. This comes from Saul. So it says, so much of this feels like it comes back to schools and education, while arts and culture has been relegated to an afterthought in many state schools and seen as a luxury. Private schools continue to invest and prioritize. How could we use the statistical story that you've collected to be part of a compelling argument to counter this growing gap, particularly at this moment when the curriculum review is taking place and it feels like change may be possible?
So I don't want to sort of name names necessarily, but I'm going to do it anyway. Which is that there's some like what I would encourage people to do is participate in the brilliant work that's already happening. I want to particularly draw attention to Campaign for the Arts, who are a brilliant organization who've done absolutely loads to support the arts in as a sort of broad ecosystem in lots of different ways that have done really effective work on drawing attention to some of these inequalities that have been described. Like the hollowing out of arts education is a disaster. The number of young people who are able to do things like take GCSEs in drama and music now compared with 10 or 20 years ago is an absolutely precipitous drop, which is a foreseeable consequence of a lot of policy interventions that have taken place. What I would advise against is that everybody individually trying to launch their own campaign and launch their own comm strategy in order to try to change minds. And instead, we're more powerful when we work together. I love the good people of Campaign for the Arts. If it was me, I would start that.
Somebody's asked, have any data about freelancers as they provide the backbone for our industry? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that is in our work, and we've written a lot about different kind of employment conditions, and that runs from like blog posts we were doing with the Centre for Cultural Value and our colleague Rebecca Florison, who's at the Work Foundation. And then we pick up on it in some of our more recent reports with Creative Peck and various other things as well.
We'll go to Michelle's question. So it says, do you have any working relationships with local public health teams to unify and work together to tackle the inequalities in arts and opportunities?
Short answer to that is no. Basically, because there are good things about division of labor. There are lots and lots of people who are working effectively on arts and health. Dave mentioned at the start that we start the book by talking about the sort of culture is good for you narrative, which includes a lot of stuff about arts and health. I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm quite happy to leave them to it. There's loads of great work going on. A lot of that, there's been a lot of investment from places like the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who've supported us as well in terms of those relationships. I'm really glad that that work is going on. And to be honest, I'm really glad that I am not one of the people doing it because I don't understand enough about medicine and epidemiology.
I slightly disagree on that, just from the all money is good money. And to pick up actually and reinforce a point Mark said earlier, many of these things are not going to change the problem, but they're going to probably stop it getting worse. And stopping things getting worse is good. And again, we shouldn't sort of underestimate the importance of effectively kind of making sure the dam is not leaking in a context where there might be a quite serious flood coming with things like local authority funding cuts.
Yeah, I would just add that I know that I have a friend who's a midwife who's just been on a course about social prescribing and so on. I know that there is a really lot of interesting work going on in that area. At the same time, the arts organisations and venues need to be there for them. That they're not going to be an investment by public health. Public health have their own have the health service has a lot of stuff it needs to invest in. So it's very happy to engage in culture on top of that, and the culture has to be there for it to to prescribe it, recommend it, whatever. But
And just to add something, there's a whole thing about AI and digitalization, democratizing arts and culture participation and audiences. What do the three of you think about this wave heading our way?
I mean, first things first, that point really, does need to be reinforced that all of the digital stuff that organizations do, the audience patterns are the same as the real life. Apart from, we did find disabled people who were already heavy cultural consumers before the pandemic. They basically really benefited from the shift to digital. And what's kind of depressing is the way that post-pandemic there was a real rush to come back in person, and all of the sort of benefits for disabled heavy cultural consumers of the pandemic seem to have gone away a bit, and questions about accessibility that run from literally accessibility to get into buildings, but through to COVID safe spaces and stuff like that really sort of dropped off the table, which is a missed opportunity for the kind of inclusion possibilities of digital. Workforce wise, it's kind of difficult. The impact of technology is always uneven and to an extent kind of slightly unpredictable. It's likely that some jobs will disappear, and that's really bad for some people. It's highly likely that the stratification of this impact, it will not be affluent people who are really well connected, who are already well plugged in to the arts and cultural sector, who are going to be at the kind of front end of the job losses, because they are likely to be able to retrain, so they can afford new degrees and new courses and stuff like that. But equally, the sort of history of technological development suggests to us that there will be new roles and new jobs and new possibilities. And the question, it comes back to one of the education questions, is how do we support the arts workforce, often, who are really interested in new stuff, whether it's new skills, new kind of creative possibilities, new working partnerships, making new work in whatever medium. How do we kind of support them to take advantage of the possibilities and not kind of, punish them by saying, well, if you lose your job, you go into a welfare system that really hates you, we'll give you no money. And if you don't immediately start like driving a van for Amazon, we'll like force you to go to a food bank. So this kind of broader social welfare failure in British society, I think, is a quite useful starting point for the conversation about the impact of technology, rather than just, will AI take all of the theatre jobs?
But I'm going to just ask Annie McCourt, who I know a little bit, is saying, thinking about the offer, do you think the arts inherently focused on middle class taste? Orion, I think you mentioned this before. Yeah, it feels like the measure that they set the measure almost in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I should really leave these to the trained sociologists to answer, but this is really the kind of sort of fundamental underpinning of the kind of sociology of culture, and about how legitimated taste, that everybody realistically has cultural taste, whether that's EastEnders or Shinty or movies or books or whatever, carnival, or and it's just who's are legitimated, who's raised up in terms of that these are desirable, these should be promoted, people should be educated in them, we should be funding them, we should have palaces of art celebrating them, and whose are had to be run on a voluntary basis in a local community centre.
It's really interesting. Sorry, I'm going to hope the people on the call don't mind this, but I think it's really interesting in terms of the whole ecosystem. Like, I go to see things, and even when you get to critics, there was a critic who critiqued a play, and one of the critics, he gave it very few stars, and part of the reasoning was it's very like a soap opera, and it was really interesting. It was like, wow, soap opera equals what? And I think the whole ecosystem and who's critiquing the work and who are the critics hired by newspapers and television and radio, what are their educational backgrounds as the tastemakers and judges. I'm going to make an observation before I hand back to Adam as well, that the lovely Jack from Campaign from the Arts is on this call, and just wanted to say thank you, Mark, for the shout out. I think I will probably be getting in touch with Jack to possibly host something like this and shake us all up a little bit, because I only hear good things about you, Jack, as well.
Mark, David, and if you want to plug anything or shout anything out whilst you've got our audience's attention.
We've got what one of the questions was about people who leave creative work, and we've got a new report on that coming. Do you know what date, Mark, in November?
19th
of November. And then, maybe see you all in like 18 months' time for the sequel.
Great. Thank you so much. So with that said, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you to our attendees. And we'll hopefully see you shortly at the next event.